For the webinar, this meeting is going to be recorded and will be made available after the webinar ends for reference. We are happy to use the chat box both to introduce yourself for discussion and to pose questions. We're going to have a brief Q&A session after each of the 3 presentations today from our presenters, and then we'll have time for a little bit more free-form discussion at the end. So if you're able to pose your questions in the chat box, we'll take note of those and then make sure they get addressed as time allows. Just going to give a few minutes to let others join us and to let folks introduce themselves in the chat box before we get started. Well, it's great to see so many representatives from around the globe and from the private sector and the humanitarian community today. A bit of background on the ELAN, in case you're not familiar. The ELAN works to improve the impact of humanitarian cash transfers through appropriate use of payments technology. So we try to bring together the private sector and actors from the payment sector in particular with the humanitarian community to advance our understanding and practice on different e-transfer issues. The ELAN has 4 different work streams looking at the use of e-vouchers, e-cash, pathways to financial inclusion, and data management security. Our advisory group members who work closely with us include CALP, IRC, the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and Oxfam. We want to especially thank the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, who is supporting this work and enabling this webinar. So before we dive in and I introduce the great speakers that we have joining us today, just wanted to take a quick step back to highlight why digital identity matters for our humanitarian work with electronic cash transfers. And here I've included 2 pictures from different programs where this issue has come up pretty centrally. The first photo is from a program that ACF ran in Bangladesh, where they used mobile money to meet the needs of families affected by floods. And in this program, they were trying to use mobile money, but because of the lack of identity documents with some of their recipients, a portion of their beneficiaries were not able to register for mobile money accounts, and so they relied on traditional cash transfers. The second picture is from a focus group of Mercy Corps beneficiaries in Ethiopia. In that program, we were responding to drought by introducing mobile money cash transfers. And there was such a lack of identity documents with this population that Mercy Corps as an implementing agency had to work with local authorities to get thousands of beneficiaries' identity documents. So that presented, a bit of a slowdown for the program. And so this question of having and accessing reliable forms of identification can both slow down our emergency response programs, particularly when we're working with electronic cash transfers that require clear identification to open up new accounts for beneficiaries. But it's also a source of deprivation in and of itself for the populations we work with. So today we're quite interested to draw on some experts that can help us understand the concept of identity, digital identity, and hopefully introduce some new ways of thinking about these concepts and their applicability for our work. I'm just going to pause for a second and check on the audio and make sure everyone can hear me clearly. All right, great. It sounds like the audio is working okay. Thank you, everyone. Right now, I'm showing a slide that outlines one resource that the ELAN has recently put together addressing some issues around data and touching on identity. It's the Data Starter Kit. It consists of 7 tip sheets that are linked to the program management cycle and deal with really specific aspects of data management. And there's a portion of these, which are circled in this slide with the red circle, that really touch on when and how humanitarians interact with identity concepts. So we have 2 tip sheets, Know Your Customer, or KYC, and a registration tip sheet that may be of interest for this audience. So please feel free to check out the starter kit. The link is in the slide here, and we'll also put it in the chat box as a reference. Great. So I'm very, very happy to introduce our presenters today who come with a wealth of experience on identity and digital identity topics. I'll do a brief introduction now and then a bit of more in-depth introduction before each presenter gives their talk. So Shashi Raghunandan leads the identity practice at MasterCard. He'll be our first presenter. Paul Macon is the head of financial inclusion and leads the financial inclusion and mobile money practice at Consult Hyperion. And John Edge is an entrepreneur and founder specializing in private partnerships that drive legal identity and financial inclusion. He's the co-founder of ID2020. So I'm really looking forward to learning a lot today, and I'm going to hand over the microphone to Shashi to get us started.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for that wonderful introduction on the topic of identity and why it's so important in the humanitarian context. There are really a few things that I wanted to touch upon today in the presentation. I think the first thing is that in the humanitarian context, the collection and management of field data is really important. And as processes stand today, they tend to be labor-intensive and time-intensive. So there is a need in the sector, I think, to move towards a standardized way in which to collect data and also to kind of share that data. And that can generate benefits for all stakeholders in the humanitarian space. And so what I'm going to propose is a way of looking at things which are more standards-based. I'm going to draw on some experiences from the private sector where these exercises have happened. And we're going to kind of, look at how we can probably leverage some of that in the humanitarian space. So just to begin with, I wanted to set a very quick context on what an identity really is and how we should think about an identity ecosystem. Just bear with me a little bit as we go through this kind of 5 participants in an identity ecosystem, starting with the bottom left, consumers, moving on to the top left-hand side of identity providers, attribute providers, interoperability providers, and relying party. In most identity ecosystems today, if you're issuing an identity as an NGO, as someone else, I think we tend to think of probably 2 or 3 maximum participants. One is the consumers who are actually engaged in a transaction, who are actually being enrolled in an identity process. And the second is probably the identity provider, that is an NGO, somebody who's responsible for establishing and maintaining and securing that identity. But if we were to break this up and think about an ecosystem in which multiple people can participate using that identity, I think there are other roles that emerge. One is that of an attribute provider, somebody who's able to establish and maintain identity attributes, and by that I mean things like the date of birth. and the age information, for example. Then there's an interoperability provider, somebody who can enable the sharing of that information that has been captured by a single identity provider across multiple identity providers or relying parties. And the relying party is really somebody who uses that identity to deliver a certain service to the end consumer. Right? So all of these participants, if you look at it, set the framework for an identity ecosystem and are key components of that identity ecosystem. And this is really important as we step into the discussion on what is it that is actually happening today in a humanitarian context. And really, I think there are multiple challenges that are being faced today. So while the collection and management of field data is vital, the current process by the humanitarian operations tend to be labor and time intensive. So what we mean by that is, while there's a single donor who's providing funding to multiple NGOs, I think each NGO is invested in a particular process, a particular people, a particular kind of technology in issuing, collecting data and also issuing an identity. The consumers, on the other hand, also have to interact with multiple NGOs and kind of get themselves credentialed or identified for receiving a particular benefit. And if you look at the way this process is set up, I think we would say that there are multiple, silos, if you will, of NGOs operating their own proprietary technologies. And there's really not too much sharing of information between these NGOs that's happening. And that has certain repercussions. These are actually listed in this one. So I think the pain points that this actually brings up is that from a consumer perspective or a service user perspective, there is this thing of don't want to register for many simultaneous programs. It would be much easier if I were to be able to register with a single NGO and then share that information with multiple NGOs to claim my benefits. The NGOs themselves want to be able to provide aid quickly with the minimum overhead. So I think there's this entire thing of productivity, time invested in the field and collecting data, which is commonly collected across NGOs and kind of using that information across NGOs. Closely linked to that is the donors who want to be able to have clean information flowing back to them based on beneficiaries who have been provided that benefit, and also at how many of them have actually received the benefit, and how many NGOs have reached out to them to provide all of that benefit. Finally, I think from a government perspective, I think they also want to look at ways in which an integration into the mainstream can happen, or at least an identification of these beneficiaries can happen. And so there are some strengths in strengthening that, or there are some benefits in strengthening the digital identities. I think it does provide an accountability to the affected population. It provides accuracy, convenience, and increased efficiency for definitely the NGOs. Flexibility of platforms in terms of being able to kind of port your information across multiple platforms for the NGOs. And possibility to develop targeting models. So the information that comes off of the platforms can actually be used to program certain benefits depending on the needs of the service user, and many, many more. So really there is, I think what we're trying to establish through the first few slides is really the need, which is that there is this entire, NGO silos, if you will, of technology that are operating today in collecting information and distributing aid. And there is a need today to kind of enable a sharing of that information, or at least the bare minimum information across the NGOs, so that they can add to benefits, not just for consumers or service users, but also to NGOs and donors and governments. I think, there are multiple kind of benefits that can be had from this. I don't want to go into the details of this slide, but really suffices to say that there are ways in which this can be resolved that can enable not just increased service benefits for NGOs, but also for the consumer, and then tighter integration or quicker integration into mainstream society, and also linkage into the formal financial ecosystem. So there is a way to think about the way data is collected, processed, credentialized, and then shared with the service user, so that eventually, as he or she steps out into into a mainstream ecosystem, there's a way of integrating him into that ecosystem. And so, as we think about these, the kind of end state of such a service, I think we need to think about, what is it that each of these stakeholders really need. So things like control over data, which is important to a service user, accessing services without sharing unnecessary data, can accessing identity from multiple providers in multiple locations. So all of these become kind of needs or ideal design principles of designing such an identity from a service user perspective. Similarly, from an NGO perspective, I think there are various design principles there as well. Is there a standard methodology? Can there be a digital audit trail? Can there be interoperability between programs and agencies? And so on, from a donor perspective, allowing for a clear line of accountability and traceability back to the end service user, and then to the governments, so as to provide more transparency and tracking of flow of funds. These, if you will, can form the foundations of a design principle that can go behind the sharing of data across NGOs. But we also realize that in designing something that can share, a design principle that can share all of this data between NGOs, there are a range of constraints that hinder the way, or that constrain the way in which we can do that. So obviously today there are no such standards that exist in the humanitarian space that allow for such sharing to happen. So framework needs to be put in place, organization capacity needs to be built in, training needs to be provided, funding needs to be provided. Of course, the culture of R&D needs to be kind of inculcated, and then there needs to be a lot of pre-preparation capacity that needs to be built in before going into and disbursing the aid. So all of these are constraints in reaching that end state, but I think there is a way in which this can be had and can be achieved. I just want to kind of take a quick pause there and kind of recap the ground that we have covered so far, just in establishing an identity framework, and then in kind of walking through, if you will, the key challenges in starting to frame some of those discussions, and also some of the challenges that we have in implementing some of those things. So the idea there being that as NGOs start evolving and the technology gets a little bit more mature, and more and more programs start getting implemented on the field, there is a need to kind of harmonize some of that information, to be able to share that information that can result in benefits for everybody. And while there are significant benefits and design principles that can go behind it, there are also a lot of challenges in implementing it. I just want to draw out on some of the examples from the private sector in implementing these standards, and some of the ways in which collaborations like this have happened in the private sector. So if you look at, I wanted to bring to light about 3 or 4 different examples. So one is the FIDO Alliance, started by the vision of probably a single person, who was looking to sell a piece of technology, but came to the conclusion that a wider industry collaboration was required if he had to kind of, around standardization of online access of, let's say, financial transactions, or just the way you access information online. So instead of selling that piece of technology, he went ahead and formed the FIDO Alliance, which kind of brought together a range of industry players in forming a standard which would enable and move the industry forward towards a common standard for accessing information online. So that could be via a variety of means, and that simply became the FIDO Alliance. They now have a set of standards published and are making good progress in getting everyone certified and kind of moving towards that. The other two exchange, the other two are the Open Identity Exchange, and of course MasterCard itself has evolved from its own set of standards which formed as a collaboration of banks that wanted to share information and data and account credit information with each other. And so if you look at the way all of these are structured, they're more or less formed as collaborations and people of groups of NGOs or banks or industry players coming together, agreeing on a set of shared principles, agreeing that this is a need, and then progressing that in a methodical manner. So there is significant, I think, learnings that are to be had from the private sector. My point here simply is that I think there is a need in the sector to move towards such standards that can enable a lot of efficiency through the donor funding process as well as the aid distribution process, leading right down to the service user. And probably we have a lot to learn from the private sector around that. So I'll just take a pause there and kind of, see if there are any questions.
Shashi, thank you so much for that overview. I think you've made a really clear case for the opportunities in this particular space, but also that there would be, for many of us in our agencies, quite a bit of work to move to a new way of managing identity of our beneficiaries. I wanted to take a chance here to just check the pulse of our attendees. And I'm curious for the humanitarians that have joined us today, within your own agencies, feel free to respond in the chat box, but do you feel that within your agencies there is a strong appetite for looking at new ways of addressing this identity and identity management question? Or do you feel that it's an issue that's not really on the radar yet? We'd be quite curious to know sort of where your agencies stand on that question. Shashi, we have one question coming in now, which is probably the only one we have time for until the end. So from the list of constraints and barriers that you shared, what would you consider to be the top 1 to 2 constraints in terms of moving the industry forward on this?
Yeah, I think, and I think this is feedback that we've gathered through our engagement, so it's not just my views, but I think what we're hearing is certainly, there's a behavioral and people and cultural change that needs to be affected. I think that is huge. Technically, I think the standards and forming a standards body, the technology behind it, I think can be overcome just because of the pace at which these things tend to move. But I think for me, the number one challenge that could come up is the way that we have to change mindsets, change behaviors on the field, and also kind of the way that the NGOs operate to enable this kind of data sharing. And that would probably come about through significant amount of training and funding. So it calls for a lot of investment as well, not just funding dollars, but also in terms of time. And that has to come from the donor community. So it has to be a buy-in. And for me, that's the second biggest challenge. A broader industry buy-in. This is something that is required to be done, and this is an opportune time to do it, and be actors in it, and this is the way that we can move forward, and this is what we can learn from the private sector. So it becomes, for me, the second biggest challenge, kind of getting the relevant parties together. I think the third, which is far, I think, not as big a stumbling block is probably the technology side of things. As I was saying, I think we are fortunately in an day and age where these changes and these kind of standards can be adopted fairly quickly. The FIDO Alliance has shown us that these kind of standards can be developed in record time of up to about 18 months or so, and certifications can be started almost immediately thereafter. So these kind of things can happen rapidly. So I'm not that concerned about the technology, but certainly the first two do concern me.
Great. Thanks, Shashi. Thanks for laying out both. I think so, yeah. Thank you for laying out some of the vision for the opportunities and challenges and increasing the efficiency of our current data management, identity management practices within the sector, the humanitarian sector. We will have time to discuss your ideas and proposals towards the end of the session. But now we're going to move on to allow Paul Macon from Consult Hyperion to share with us some of his thoughts. Paul has been active in the specification, development, and operation of digital financial services since 2004. He was co-creator, along with Nick Hughes and Susie Leone, of M-Pesa, mobile money services, so truly experienced in this realm. And his work in the privacy and identity space has worked at a few extremes, including KYC registrations of farmers with limited identity documents in rural Nigeria, and strategies for identity management, anti-money laundering, and privacy for recipients of remittances in Somali, along with analysis of worldwide trends in data privacy for the Omidyar network. He's also done work with the World Bank, analyzing uses of digital identity for financial inclusion, and in particular looking at digital identity strategies for financial inclusion in South Africa. So we're really grateful to Paul for taking some time to join us and share some insights and how they may be applicable for our space today. Paul, I will hand it over to you.
Oh, hello, can you hear me? Remember to unmute my line just in time. Okay, great. Well, Lily, thank you for that introduction. Yes, I've been working, as Lily said, in digital and mobile financial services since 2004. My interest was always in the development of innovative ways of reaching out to people across Africa and South Asia. And I think from the very, very early stages, it became clear that essentially identity is a vital element of every single service, and it becomes more important as time goes on. So I'm going to do a brief introduction to identity in general as it applies to both national scale identity services and also localized identity, which probably relates the most to the majority of participants today, and talk about some of the lessons that we've learned. So first of all, probably building slightly on what Shashi was just saying, to establish first what we mean by digital identity. And we have defined three vital phases. So there's the identification phase. You first of all have to work out who somebody is in front of you, to some degree of confidence. And obviously if it's a national identity service, that's based on birth records, that kind of thing. And then later, there's the authentication element. So somebody comes along to access the service, and at that point, they're asserting who they are, and you need to find some way of authenticating that via an electronic means, such as biometrics or PIN or whatever it might be. And then there's the third element. Once somebody has asserted their identity, how can they use that identity? Why do we think all this is important? Well, it's absolutely key for financial and digital inclusion. That's the main thing from my perspective. You can quickly onboard customers to get security, less friction, and you can build personalized services through better knowledge of the customer. And we also say repeatedly that privacy is important. It doesn't matter who it is. Even if you're poor, you have a right to privacy. And I think that that sometimes gets forgotten. So moving on to example digital identities, there are obviously government electronic identity services. So thinking of, in particular, NADRA in Pakistan, Aadhaar in India, NIMSI in Nigeria. And of course, there are a number in the Western world as well. Then we have services like Bank Logon. Then there's Mobile Connect that the GSMA are developing at the moment. Then the social media logon. So we have things like Facebook, and all of these have different levels of assurance around them. So therefore, different qualities associated on them. So the quality, we say, is based on the steps that are taken to verify the claims attributes. and later on, when using the service, the robustness of the authentication credentials established. In our work, we've developed a roadmap for digital ID and financial inclusion. And you can see right at the top, we have putting the individual at the center of privacy protection. We think this is very important. You have to give individuals control over how their personal data is going to be used, whoever you are, whoever your service is aimed at. It needs to be reflected in the entire approach to the digital identity system. There needs to be an effective legal environment in a country to safeguard it, and designed in right. And then moving on to slightly more esoteric, you have to separate identification from authentication and authorization. They're three separate processes, and they should be treated as such. But if you're going to talk about really getting that service out as quickly as possible, you've got to improve the authentication process first, get that working, and then worry about the identification. Because if you do the identification first, then there's no authentication, but people lose interest, and really the value of the identification process is wasted. There has to be a viable commercial model, whatever the scheme, because otherwise, again, if the very people involved in serving in using a scheme or operating the scheme have no long-term interest in it, then it will die out. And you have to give some thought to who will actually pay for an identity service. You need to give some thoughts to who is liable for failures of identity. And finally, review the role of compulsion. Are you going to force people to register for a service? So moving on perhaps to the more directly relevant to this audience, we have defined three forms of identity. First is the foundational one. Foundational identity, we mean a core digital identity created out of a national identity scheme or similar. It can be based on the formal establishment of identity and enables a wide variety of services. Here we're thinking governmental identity services. We then have developed the concept of deriving other identities from that, other digital identities. So first of all, the functional identity. This is a digital identity which is used to address the needs of sectors such as or banking. And here I'm thinking about ELAN in Nigeria. And then we have transactional identities, which are probably most relevant to this audience. Again, derived from a foundational identity, and which is designed to ease the conduct of transactions, either face-to-face, across multiple sectors. So, first of all, to identity before you even start. Depending on what you're trying to do, different qualities of identity verification are necessary. And as Shashi mentioned, there we go. We need to think about the beneficiaries. People don't want to register separately for every service. Interoperability is something that we should be striving for. There's no point in people registering multiple times for services, as we've seen. And in fact, in an operation we led in Nigeria, we ran into registration fatigue, where people would just refuse to register for another service. And I think that's going to be increasingly a problem. Engage with the regulatory authorities, in particular central banks. This stuff matters to financial regulators, and it should matter to you because they have the ability to prosecute you if you get it wrong. And that should be particularly important for your compliance officer and your country manager. Make sure they know what you're doing. Because get this wrong, someone might be going to jail. It really does matter. It is that important. On the ground, think about during registration, what document types are you going to accept during the registration process? You need to think about the consequences for the services that can be delivered based on the decision you make about the types. What about people who don't have any documents? How about creating a new baseline identity document? That sounds great, and it's certainly what the UNHCR do in many of their operations. They create a new baseline document for people who don't have any documents. And that works, or has worked up till now, but it's increasingly becoming a problem where other people in the financial sector refuse to trust those documents. And you shouldn't really blame the bank for that. The financier, they don't want to go to jail either. And there have been plenty of cases of banks almost being shut down when they've got this wrong. So they're very sensitive about it. Talking about delivery of service then, you need to think about means of authentication. It could be PIN or biometric, or what's very cost effective, in fact, is the idea of a manual biometric. It's also part of measuring eligibility for a service as well. What food or non-food items, how much cash, etc. And then we come to the question, which I always try to avoid, frankly, cash. For us, cash is just a nightmare. It cannot be delivered to people who don't have high-quality identities at the time of registration. You need to be thinking about traceability and accountability. We hear lots of stories about cash being paid out to people who amount to fronts who turn out to be collecting it for inappropriate groups. And that's an issue certainly for governments and funding agents. Regulators payment providers, payment operators really don't like it because they don't want to be prosecutors either. And it's an expensive logistical nightmare. Trying to keep initiatives such as the Cash Alliance initiative in Nigeria, and we look at the NGO sector and we think that everybody's trying to go to paper-based cash, and we think, no, please don't. It's just a nightmare. We understand that beneficiaries like it, but in terms of the service operation and the compliance, it's a nightmare. The benefits of focusing on identity, in particular electronic identity, is, first of all, you have a happy compliance officer. He knows what's happening. You can see precisely who's doing what, where. You get great monitoring and evaluation. You can do reports right the way down to the transactional level, so that keeps the funding agencies happy. It's the best of all worlds.
Paul,
so
I'm going to
stop you
for a second, just to, in interest of time and to try to summarize and give you a chance to quickly respond to some of the comments coming up in the chat box.
Okay.
I think you're surfacing some quite interesting and in some ways provocative differences of priorities or viewpoints that may exist between the humanitarian world and the digital financial services world in general. Philippe was commenting a bit on this larger issue of the need to balance complexity and ability to kind of link to new and additional services and all the other benefits of traceability with the reality of the urgency of a response context. So I think that that is a central tension here that we're all struggling with. Another issue I think that is quite interesting that you've raised is really for us what I think there are substantial and concrete differences between the requirements for managing identities within a humanitarian program and context versus those that are offering a financial service, new digital financial service may have. I think this is an issue we're still kind of trying to navigate as humanitarian organizations and practitioners. But a question for you, I mean, do you see differences between the bar that a humanitarian organization would need to be held to in terms of creating identities and using identities versus a financial service provider?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just skip to that. The issue of the baseline documents, it is a necessary reality, I agree, but it all comes down to the types of financial services you can then deliver. Keeping things electronic for somebody with baseline documents is a viable approach. You can conceivably deliver cash transfers, and you can deliver services based on that. Access to food, access to other non-food items, whatever it may be. The moment you start to allow people to cash out, those baseline identities start to look very dubious. And that I think is my key concern. I don't think I really need to say more than that. The idea of sending cash and keeping it electronic is defensible when you're talking to regulators, because you can see where the money is being spent. And yes, there are inevitably issues around, what is actually happening on the ground, but in the end, if you're dealing in relatively small transactions and you are making best effort and you're tracing the transactions as far as you can, that is at least defensible. The moment you're sending people $100 and allowing them to cash out en masse, you're opening yourself to some serious questions. What was the other question, Lily?
I think we can actually pause there. And there's a robust conversation going on in the chat box, which we can come back to towards the end. But I'm going to allow us to move on to have John speak briefly. And then we'll come back to some of these really interesting, challenging, and provocative issues that you've raised. So thank you.
Okay.
Great. So next up, we have John Edge. John Edge is an entrepreneur and founder. As I mentioned before, he's specializing in public-private partnerships to drive legal identity and financial inclusion. He co-founded ID2020, which is a nonprofit focused on bringing emerging technology to the challenge of stateless, vulnerable children. He's also the co-chair and founder of the Whitechapel think tank, and is the chairman of the Get GCS, a new platform for financial inclusion. So I think following along the trend on zooming out further and further from our kind of immediate humanitarian world, John's going to be able to present us with some new ideas here. So over to you, John.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Sounds great, thank you.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and great to speak to everybody. The first slide is to stimulate the thought process around what's going to happen when we have billions of people connected to trillions of devices. I am a co-founder and managing partner of a venture investment firm focused on the transformation that will occur during this connectivity. So I thought that the first two presentations were very interesting to give an insight on where the world is today. There was talk of documents, there was talk of how siloed organizations could coordinate with each other, and this is very much the current paradigm. As a venture investor, we invest in the future. And as I move through this presentation, what I want to highlight here is that there's new technology emerging, and always with new technology there's a challenge. There's a challenge that established institutions and markets have an understanding of their current paradigm, and this will be to do with, in this case, cards, fingerprint scanners, documents, all this current infrastructure that, as I can tell by looking in the chat channel, is incredibly challenging. Then there's the emerging technologies, where connecting to the people who are advancing emerging technologies is very difficult, because the people on the cutting edge of emerging technologies often don't have access to the established institutions. I can put it more in a more straightforward basis. It's very rare that these people all meet in the same pub. People are distributed around the world. The engineering is done in different communities, and how we connect those is a challenge. This presentation is to discuss decentralization. Now, the Bitcoin logo is up there, which will probably raise some eyebrows. Bitcoin has proven that decentralized systems can be effective in the distribution of value. Now, the key here is the word decentralization. What we've heard discussed today and what the entire world has used up until now for the last 60, 80 years has been centralized systems. And as we know, centralized systems simply don't work at any form of massive scale, because there's always a challenge around where the data is, who's using the data, how's it shared, what are the standards, and so on. The future state that we can get to is a no password, which is very interesting, multinational, borderless, currency agnostic cash network, cash transfer network. And in fact, it might not even be cash. It may well be value, where you're distributing the value required to purchase a service, such as childcare. The key here is none of this works, as we all know, without identity. But I want to stress here a thought point of the difference between identity and credential. So, identity is, to my mind, about who you are as a person. And when we've had these discussions today, we talk about identity in terms of what documents are issued. Identity documents aren't necessarily issued. Credential documents are issued. And if we separate out that and think about identity, then we make the person and who they are the center of their system. So the thought of this new system for identity is that every single person has their own identity and then accesses credentials. I'll bring it on to ID2020. So I co-founded ID2020 as a social impact initiative as part of our overall work, when we noticed that the technology that could change the future, these decentralized identity-centric self-sovereign systems, doesn't exist and doesn't have a place to have a voice. So this is an entirely new way of thinking. It would make the core identity systems of every single NGO, every single government, every single corporate fundamentally different. And it would be based on the person and the person's access to technology. Now, we always get the discussion here that, on a mountaintop in the desert with no Wi-Fi, how would it work? But as a venture capitalist, I'm thinking about how the future is going to evolve. We know what the problem is. 1.5 billion, give or take 1.5 billion people have a lack of identity. We know who this affects. We also know that goal 16.9 of the Sustainable Development Agenda is to, by 2030, provide legal identity for all. Now that's really interesting to me. I've not seen anybody, apart from Facebook, Google and Microsoft, build a common identity system that runs for 1 billion people. And we started ID 2020 in 2014 saying that there'd be 15 years to see if this new technology, changing the entire way identity works, could be deployed and tested by 2020, and if it worked, scaled to 1 billion people by 2030. We are 2 years into this, and we've not started to deploy any technology as an organization because of the challenges around policy and coordination. This will likely change in the near future, and it's an interesting point about funding. ID 2020 is the only global initiative coordinating UN, World Bank, NGO to focus on a completely different identity system based off decentralized technology. And it is our hypothesis that the only way to solve this problem is to do something completely different. Why would this work? Well, we're distributing an infrastructure on a scale that's unprecedented. The distribution of devices estimated over the next 5 years will transform the planet. 5 billion people on the planet will have a smartphone. So that means that it's potentially like the question, at any given time, how far are you away from a smartphone? It may be that you don't have one, but how far are you away from one? So ID2020's objective is to create this bridge between emerging technology, NGOs and governments. On May the 20th this year, in a partnership with the United Nations, we hosted a summit. We had 154 private sector companies, 15 NGOs, 400 people to discuss the way forward for testing this specific type of technology on this challenge. ID2020 is the central coordinating body for this new technology, working with these organizations. It has these tasks, but I think, keeping an eye on time, I want to skip to Gavi. Gavi was founded in 2000, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, and 85% of all children on the planet today have been vaccinated by Gavi. It was a technology centered around an organization, distributed around the world. And we think that immunization is the entry point for this new identity system, where we have high rates of immunization, so there's physically hands-on a person or a child, and at the time the identity is not being captured, and that this is an opportunity to deploy this new technology to create a different sort of identity system. And thank you very much for the time. I'll take some questions as we go.
John, thank you so much. Very interesting zoom out and overview of an initiative that could have big dividends in this space. I am going to attempt, there's been a lot of chatter and back and forth in the chat box and a lot of really interesting points. I'm going to invite folks to pose additional questions in the chat box. And while those are being formulated, I'm going to try to summarize some of the discussion that's been happening for the larger group. I think this point about thinking about identity early and for humanitarians in particular in the process, and thinking about the actors in that process. I think the slide that Shashi had raised with the different identity actors was quite interesting and not normally how we conceive of kind of data management or processes, but has some utility for us in the humanitarian space. Sarah in the chat box pointed out that overcoming some of the inefficiencies and weaknesses in our current identity management practices are, quote, possible to overcome, but it's not a quick fix. And there was a lot of dialogue around kind of the need for increased efficiency, particularly around double registrations, multiple registrations of the same beneficiaries by different agencies and different programs, and a desire for interoperability, but a recognition that that is not easy for us to attain. Paul commented just now on the fact that the absence of a common vocabulary makes talking about this or making progress on this difficult. And there were some comments about, and I think general recognition that the right to privacy is important and should be protected, even if you're poor, or especially for the. We have some. So with that, I'm going to just pause for a second and see which questions are coming up. Okay, I think we have concluded the brief musical interlude, so thanks for your patience with that. And I just want to check and see if the audio is back. If you could let me know in the chat box. Thanks, everyone. So a few more takeaways and comments from the chat box discussion. When cash is kept electronic, regulators are happy, but cash out changes things. And that there's concern that centralized systems cannot reach massive scale. So in conclusion, we've got just 3 minutes left. The time passes so quickly on these. I would love to hear from participants in the chat box if you have any reflections on how this may affect or change or intersect with work that's going on within your agencies. I will also repost the link to the ELAN Data Starter Kit, which may have some useful resources touching on these themes, and see if there are any final questions.
Oh, shut down.
Laura, yeah, we are recording this webinar. It will be made accessible on the ELAN website on the CALP page, and we'll send a link to the recording to everyone that was registered here as well. Great. So I just want to thank everyone, particularly our presenters that joined us today. John, Shashi, Paul, for sharing some really useful insights into a topic that is quite new to many of us in the humanitarian space. So we appreciate your time, and we're looking forward to more discussion, more initiatives in this and on this topic. So thank you everyone for joining. We will be sure to share the webinar link to the recording with you, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.